So you are watching your first video for negotiations, and this is going to be just an introductory video. Some of the stuff I'll talk about might be in chapters 1 and 2, and then in the section of 31 through 42 that I've assigned for you initially. And some of it may overlap things you'll get to in the process, and some of it may not even appear anywhere in the in those chapters. So I'm not going to just repeat what's in the chapters, and I'm not simply going to follow the reading assignments as I do the videos. So just know that in advance. Let me talk about some basics before we get started. And you will see me from time to time looking down. I've got some notes in front of me, and that's what I'm doing. So keep that in mind. And by the way, I'll try to make these videos reasonably short so that I'm not having you watching a video for an hour or something crazy like that. Basics about negotiation before we start. First, and probably the biggest point and probably the most important point is that negotiation is like anything else. And that is that it can be learned. Most things you will find in life, and many of you already know this, they can be learned. Now, basketball, you'll hear people say, well, you can't teach tall. Or with football, if you've got a lineman in football and they'll say you can't teach big. Well, that's true. Okay, so you can't teach those things, but those aren't learned anyway, and we all know that. But anything that can be learned by anyone who's willing to learn it. And so wherever you think you are in the scheme of negotiating skills or abilities, you can learn to negotiate well. It's really more of a learning thing than it is an art. I mean, there may be some art to it, I guess, in terms of the finer points, but anyone who's willing to spend some time and energy can do it and do it well. So here's a definition of negotiation: process in which two or more participants attempt to reach a joint decision on matters of common concern in situations where they are in potential disagreement or conflict. Now, the only problem with that is that you might already be in disagreement or conflict. So it's not a perfect definition, but it's not a bad one. 2 points here to note: the parties determine the outcome. Whenever you enter a negotiation, the parties have complete control of the process. And that's probably one of the best things about negotiation, whether it's done via actual just back and forth negotiation, however that's done. And we'll talk about a variety of methods you can negotiate through and with, and media you can use, and the ups and downs of those media as we go along. But that's one way to do it. Mediation is another frequent way that people negotiate. And I know these days mediation has become a huge thing, and a lot of people are doing mediation in a variety of settings. I have predominantly for the past, 27 years, worked in the personal injury field, either as plaintiff's counsel or defense counsel on one side or the other, mostly defense, but about 2/3, 1/3, I guess. And I've seen mediation done frequently, and I've seen it done more and more and more and more over the last 10 years. The first 15 or 16 years that I was out there practicing, mediation was not something that we saw very frequently. The last 10 or so, it has become almost absolute. And in fact, many courts are simply not just suggesting, but requiring that litigants use mediation before they ever go to trial, and of course many cases settle as a result of it. So that's become a big part of how negotiation is completed. The lawyer-client, and I'm going to do some screen sharing here. I hope we'll see. There we go. There's our client. I trust you see that. The lawyer-client relationship defined throughout the rules of professional conduct is important to follow. We will talk some about that as we go along. I mean, this is a legal negotiations course, and so we will talk about the implications, because it's not the same as other relationships. Lawyers have a heightened duty and a heightened responsibility that isn't necessarily part of the negotiation that occurs with other people. For instance, a real estate agent negotiating a contract may not have the same heightened duties that an attorney has. I'm not saying they don't have any duties, but their duties may not be quite as heightened as those imposed on lawyers. So, I mean, I've had several people over the years who've taken this course who've been in the business of real estate, and while I understand certainly there are business ethics rules there, they may not be as demanding as those placed on lawyers. So don't think they're the same. That's my only point. What else have we got going on here? Well, we've got rule 1.2 of the model rules, and I want to talk about that briefly because it deals with who gets to decide what. And here's the basic substance of it. The client decides the substance of the negotiation, what offers to make, accept, or reject, in essence. The client is not in full control of the means to the end. The client is in absolute control of the end. And so the client is going to always be the one to decide, here's what I want to do. And so you can't say, there's nothing you can say about that. If you think the client's all washed up, you think the client is out of their mind, you're going to have to use whatever skill you have to persuade the client that you think they're veering off into la land. But you can't stop them. If the client says settle for $5 and you think $10 is really a more reasonable settlement, and the client says, I don't care, settle for $5, guess what? You're settling for $5. You don't get to decide that. There is, of course, those unusual circumstances, which I will suggest to you almost never happen, but I can't say they don't. And that would be the client says settle for $5, you think it's worth 10, and you call the other side and you say, look, can you get me 10? And they say, sure. You can then go back to the client and say, hey, look, I got you 10. All right, I know you told me to settle for 5, but I got you 10. It would be almost impossible for the client to argue about that. So that'd be the one rare instance where you might be able to do something like that. But like I said, that almost never happens. That's very unusual. So the client decides the ends, the client decides the substance of the negotiation. What are we negotiating about? For instance, let's say you're doing some kind of very large business deal and it's got a lot of moving parts. The client is the one who decides which moving parts they care about and which moving parts the client doesn't care about. And so in our prior picture, if our guy gets his cane up and starts whacking us on the head and saying, hey, y'all cut out, so I don't want that. I don't want that as part of the deal here. Well, then guess what? It's not part of the deal. So if, the warehouse down on 48th Street isn't part of the deal and he doesn't want it and he doesn't care, then guess what? The warehouse on 48th Street isn't part of the deal. And there's nothing you can do to change that, again, except attempt to persuade the client if you think it's in the client's best interest. You're going to have to do some work. Second thing is the attorney decides in consultation with the client the means to the end. And what does this mean? That means that ultimately you as the attorney or you as the law office, right, you have the ability to determine the means by which a matter is negotiated. Now, look, this varies because sometimes attorneys have extremely sophisticated clients and those clients are intimately involved in the negotiation. Sometimes attorneys have less sophisticated clients and those clients are not as intimately involved, and that all depends on the circumstances, obviously. And so there's no blanket rule here, and the fact is that ultimately you're going to want to abide by your client's wishes as much as possible because, of course, you want the client to either recommend you to others or you want the client to continue being a client and so forth. And so at some point, when the chips are really in, as it were, you're going to mostly do what your client asks, particularly when the client is sophisticated. When clients are less sophisticated, they will normally defer. Hey, you negotiated however you want. Here's what I'm looking for. In the car accident cases that I've been involved in for many years, on both sides, you're just mostly negotiating about a number, and it's really not complicated in that sense. And so when you're negotiating about a number, the client says, get me $5, and if you can get them $5, great. And the client may say, look, if you can get me $5, anything over that, I don't care about. But if you can get me more, of course, get me more, but $5 is good. And then you know what you're dealing with. And likewise, on the other side, if the other side says, look, don't pay more than $5, well, then you know what you're dealing with. So those are the kinds of things that you might find yourself looking at. Let's see if we've got one more slide here. Risk return is an important thing to know about your client. You're going to want to know your client's risk tolerance. This is incredibly important this applies across the board with negotiations. Again, the things I'm telling you now all apply across the board. That's why I'm doing it now. So you got to know what the client's risk return is. Every client has a level of risk that they'll tolerate. Some are extremely risk averse, and some people, as you know, some people are extremely willing to take any risks. And so you've got to know that, and you've got to make sure you understand that. And that's part of your challenge when you're getting ready to negotiate and preparing for the negotiation, is understanding how much risk your client's willing to take. For instance, this could be a factor if you are involved in a negotiation in which you are face-to-face, you are at another party's office, and you have told your client, if we get to point X and they don't go any further, we're going to walk out. And we're going to walk out because I want to make a big fuss, and I want to make a big fuss because I think if I do that, it's going to push their buttons enough that they will be concerned about our future plan of action. My current employer likes to say the following. He likes to say that well, I'm not quoting him accurately here, but he basically says, random behavior is a powerful weapon, or, strange behavior is a powerful weapon, words to that effect. And sometimes that kind of action can be very powerful when somebody doesn't know what's coming. And so you need to, again, your client needs to be aware of that. If you're going to do something unusual, the client needs to know, and you need to know whether the client's willing to take the gamble. Professionalism is extremely important. Look, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a long, long time, and I will tell you, this is what I've told student after student, particularly those who are interested in becoming lawyers. I know for some of you in this class, that's not something you're interested in, and that's fine. And then some of you, maybe you're thinking law into the future. And let me just offer you this piece of advice, having been around lawyers for many, 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 many years. Your integrity and your professionalism and your standing in the community on those items are significantly more important than whether people think you're good at your job. I can't tell you how many times I've heard something like this. Yeah, that guy's a great lawyer, or that gal's a great lawyer, but I wouldn't trust him with my, toothbrush. I wouldn't trust him with $1. Well, whoa, you don't want anyone ever saying that about you. I'd rather, and I've told students this I started teaching at Regent in 2005, and I have told students this since then. I would rather have someone say, yeah, he's a decent lawyer, he's not the greatest, but you can trust anything he says. I'd much rather have them say that. And I'm not kidding when I say that. I'd much rather have them say that about me, because when they say that, what that's saying is that this person is extremely professional and that they abide by the rules of professional conduct, and that you know that whatever they tell you is trustworthy and therefore reasonable. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be tough. It doesn't mean that they won't push hard. It doesn't mean they won't represent their client, very, very strongly and with a lot of gusto, but it does mean that this lawyer is not going to violate the rules and is not going to break the law. And so we have to keep all those things in mind as we're negotiating. Some people like to rock climb, others like to take pictures of mountains from far, far away, right? And so you just need to know which your client is. All right, so a couple of nuts and bolts. Often it's the case that negotiations go back and forth. You know this, but rarely do you get into a room, sit down, and just really bang through a negotiation in 3-4 hours or whatever. That's almost never the case. And in fact, I will candidly say I don't know that I've ever seen that happen. Negotiation always I can't say always, almost always opens with some kind of salvo, whether it be a letter, whether it be a phone call, an email, whatever, and things then go from there. And it's just highly, highly unusual to walk in for everybody to get into a room and they just hassle it out and they drink a bunch of coffee and they roll their sleeves up and they unloosen their ties and all that good stuff you've seen in the movies. That's just not true. I mean, it's just not. Let me put it this way: that's not what I've observed, and that's not what I've been involved in 30 plus years of being a lawyer, and 27 in a very specific arena where there is a lot of negotiating going on. I've just not seen that. So you can say it, but that's probably not true. Clients usually like to start tough, or at least they like to start thinking they're tough, and that's fine. And both sides have an expectation that everybody's going to start tough. I don't think that's a big problem. Have to have things in place, though, to get your client to understand that being tough isn't the only purpose here. Often what you will find is as you are negotiating, you are finding things out. You don't know everything going into the negotiation necessarily. I'll tell you in particular, let me tell you a little story, and I will do this as we go along in these videos. I'll tell you some stories from my years of practice. I had a case with a very, very good lawyer. In fact, this guy practices in Norfolk, Virginia still, and is probably the best trial attorney I've ever seen, and one of the best lawyers I've ever known and dealt with. And I had many cases with him over the years, and was just pleased to deal with him. And we had a case going, and his client, he'd made a demand on us. This is when I worked doing insurance defense work. And so he had asked for a certain amount of money, and we, of course, were not prepared to pay that certain amount of money at that point. And we were involved in litigation. So we were, moving the process forward to trial. And I get a call from him out of the blue one day. And he just says, my client will take the last offer. And it was, I don't know. I didn't think we were going to settle it for that. I thought, yeah, we're going to have to put more money on this case to make it go away. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. That information never developed. And so you get into those kind of circumstances sometimes where things come up, and what happened? I never did ask him. I always meant to. And I never did. I don't know that he would have told me anyway. He probably wouldn't have, because that's the kind of lawyer he was. He wouldn't have wanted to give away any secrets of his own, let alone, it wasn't really probably appropriate for him to tell me any details about his client. But my point is that sometimes there are things out there that you think you might know going into a negotiation and you have no idea. And so don't assume ever, and always, and this is something you're going to hear me say in this class, and I may say it more than once, but you're going to see it pop up. I'll just warn you, you will see this pop up on a quiz, okay? Or on an assignment. I always say quiz, but just assignments that I give you. Questions unasked are questions unanswered. Things will come up as you are negotiating, and if you fail to ask any questions, you're never going to find out that there's this information out there. And look, I'm going to say, here's my hand, right? The information is off the screen, right? But if you don't ask, you'll never know about it. And if you don't know about it, you can't have that factor into what you're doing. And so you're going to want to, as the process goes along, always to be thinking, what can I ask? What does that mean? Is there something I can follow up with? If somebody says something that strikes you as odd, or that brings to bear something that you think may be important, after having planned for the negotiation, you then need to ask questions. Questions unasked are questions unanswered. Now, it's kind of a tautology, right? I mean, it's obvious, but yet it goes without saying, but keep that little thing and that little saying in mind whenever you're negotiating. And, of course, I've sort of mentioned this already, but I'll just say it. It's worth saying that often you'll want to adjust expectations on the fly. Sometimes you find out something. Now, a classic, for instance, of this is you are involved in a negotiation with a personal injury case, and it's in litigation. And you represent the injured party. And this does happen. It happens, I don't know how often, but it happens frequently enough that it happened to me plenty of times over the years, where I had issued medical subpoenas and gotten a bunch of medical records and combed through those medical records and found out that, Johnny Jones, the plaintiff, had actually previously injured his, left knee. And in fact, it had 2 surgeries on his left knee before the car accident. And the car accident was a little bump from behind and really wasn't very severe. And Johnny was claiming that his current knee pain was related to the car accident. There being no indication one way or the other whether he hit his knee, but he complained of it, had some swelling and so forth. And his attorney hasn't done his homework and doesn't know about these materials because he hasn't looked at them. And that is unfortunately a not all too frequent occurrence. And what might happen in the middle of that is me pulling a document out with a doctor's note that says, yeah, he's got swelling, he's got this, and he's complaining of it all the time. And me putting it out on the table and going, it looks like to me this has been an ongoing thing. We're not going to pay for that. And Johnny Jones looking at his lawyer, and here's the thing. What do? Well, they better adjust. They better adjust immediately. And so those kinds of things happen. Bending without breaking is probably a good motto here. So there's some nuts and bolts, right? Some strategy basics, and again, we're just introducing here. We're going to talk about some of these things as we go along. Some of the strategy basics, you've got your competitive strategy, you've got your cooperative strategy, and then problem solving are 3 basic strategies that you'll hear negotiations, thinkers, and academicians talk about. Competitive doesn't mean exactly what you think it means. It's sort of what you think it means. It just doesn't mean that you're aggressive. Let me put it that way. I'm not a horrifically aggressive human being, but I frequently negotiated in a competitive way, sometimes too competitive. Again, I'll tell you a short story about this. I was at a mediation with a fella who was claiming that he had a head injury as a result of the car accident, and I didn't want to, and then the claims examiner for the insurance company did not want to pay this man as much money as his attorney was asking for. And we typically would do a mediation, and we did in this case. We did a mediation, and in the mediation, I looked the man right in the eye and I said, look, I've got your prior medical records. I looked him in the eye and said, look, I've got your prior medical records, and I know about your drinking problem. And I know how long it's been going on. And I know the symptoms that you've talked about with your drinking problem. And by the way, many of those symptoms look exactly like the symptoms that you've been complaining about since this car accident, which leads me to one of 2 conclusions. Either A, you're still drinking, and this has nothing to do with the car accident, or B, you already had the symptoms, and this is just an ongoing problem that you've had as a result of years and years and years of hard and heavy drinking that damaged your brain long before you ever got in that car. And I kind of got into his face a little bit. I'm sitting across the table, so I didn't jump across the table. That's a super competitive tactic, okay, and a super competitive strategy for me to launch into this guy right at the beginning. I was somewhat aggressive in my posture as well, but it wasn't the aggressiveness of my posture that made it competitive. I could have easily sat back and said, yeah, I know what, I could have easily sat back and said, hey, you know what? I know you're a drunk and you've been a drunk for years, and that's going to mess up your brain cells, and it's going to mess up your brain. And I just don't think much of your claim here. I think you had problems long before this, and I think you're going to have problems long after this because you're an alcoholic, and that's what your real problem is. I could have just as easily done it that way. I chose not to. I had reasons for being more aggressive that had to do with the attorneys on the other side who were used to me being kind of calm, and as we would say, as younger people would say, I don't say this, but younger people might say, chill. And so they had an expectation. Cooperative tactics or strategies. Cooperative tactics or strategies are let us reason together, right? The biblical admonition, right? Come, let us reason together. Let us sit down. Let's have a glass of milk together. I'm not a drinker, so it's milk or a soft drink or something, right? Let's have a glass of Coke together. Right? Let's share it. We'll sit down. I'll have a Coke, you have a Pepsi, whatever it is you like, and let's chit chat and let's talk and let's work through the problem together. Let's find a way to solve this together. Right? We both want a solution. Let's put our heads together and come up with the answer. Now, when you have what is known as a zero-sum situation, and most of my situations were zero-sum, that is, if I gave you something, you were getting something. I mean, there's no way of getting around it. So that doesn't really work well in the zero-sum situation where one person giving means the other person's getting, and there's no increase in value, as it were. But it does work very well in situations where everybody wants a good outcome. And believe it or not, I mean, for instance, where this might work well is with sales. And again, my own experience over the years is the people who sold me stuff who I liked the best were not the people who push, or who oversold something, or who tried to pump me up for all this and that and the other. The people who always sold me the best were the people who said, look, what do you want? How much do you want to pay? And what do how can we get you from point A to point B? And sometimes the answer was, I can't help you. And sometimes the answer was, well, if we do this and this and this, we take these steps, we can get you to where we want to be. And I think of people often thinking of real estate, as this back and forth, and I want to jack them down as far as I can on the price of that house. I think you could cooperatively negotiate in a sale of a house, for instance. It's not a zero-sum game because everybody wants to get it done, right? It's not necessarily the case when you have zero-sum, like in the car accident litigation situation, or in other litigation situations where one person's loss is the other person's gain. It's not quite the same thing, but in a real estate deal, for instance, the seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to sell, everybody's motivated. And so maybe cooperating really and figuring out how everybody gets what they want as good as you can get it, maybe actually works. Problem solving is it suggests the negotiation runs into some sort of difficulty, or there's an awkwardness to the negotiation, or there's a problem that needs to be overcome, and the best way to figure that out is for everybody to put their heads together and come up with a solution to a mutual problem. A little bit different than cooperative because you're talking about something, maybe it's a problem for one side that the other side actually has a way of solving. So it's similar to cooperative, not quite the same, but generally speaking, a similar type of arrangement. And so those are some basic strategy and tactical decisions that you'll do. These are things that you want to discuss with clients when you're involved in a legal negotiation. But these kind of strategy and tactical decisions, those, generally speaking, those are going to be within the framework of the lawyer's decision making. And so here we go. So there's the negotiation process, and I'm going to talk about this very quickly. We're not going to talk about this much tonight because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this. One, you're going to do some preparation and some planning, and I think your book kind of has things probably in a little bit of a different order. This is older stuff, but it's still meaningful. Where are you going to negotiate? When? How long? How's that? Are there any ground rules? For run-of-the-mill negotiations, this never occurs. This only happens when you have really big things happening where you actually have to set an agenda. And so we may talk about that as we go along. Who starts, right, with an initial proposal? Sometimes there's a process, and there's a sort of a standard, if you will. There's sort of a business standard, or just a standard in the industry, or in that community of negotiators as to who starts. And so you don't want to slip up and be, wrong-headed. Although I will say this, even if you're not supposed to start, sometimes it's valuable for you to, shake things up a little bit and you start. When I was doing insurance defense work, it was pretty much always the plaintiff's attorney would make the first offer, and we would respond. But every once in a while, we'd I'd talk to my claims adjuster and say, look, why don't we just make an offer? And they would say, well, why would we do that? Well, because I think if we make an offer, it's going to put them on the back foot, and it'll give us some leverage, because it lets their client know, because they have to tell their client about the offer. They have to. It lets their client know that we've got the ball rolling, and it maybe puts some pressure on them. And that, we did that occasionally. Information exchange, again, questions unasked or questions unanswered. There's always a period of time during any negotiation, however long or however short, there's always some information exchanged. And so you want to be alert to that. You want to be very careful when you're thinking about it. You want to pay attention. And if it triggers something, you got to ask questions, right? You got to ask questions. And then narrowing differences occurs when everybody starts seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. My current employer was involved in a negotiation this morning by Zoom. Amazingly enough, these days, that's pretty much the standard. And he was texting me, because he's actually in another state right now. He was texting me about where things were. And at one point, I had told him, I think it looks like this number. And again, I've just been around. I know how this works. And he said, yeah. I said, would you settle for that? And he said, oh, yeah, we'll definitely settle for that. And sure enough, it settled right there. And it was you could see where it was going. They were at, X and Y, and then they were at, Y minus 5 and X minus 5, and then Y minus 10 and X minus 10. And suddenly it just started looking like, yeah, this one's starting to roll downhill. And so that's the narrowing of differences. Sometimes the narrowing of differences might be something different. It might have to do with other pieces of the puzzle. So maybe you've got a transaction that's being negotiated between two very big companies, and one of the pieces of the puzzle is, and sometimes it can be something crazy, right? Like, I really want that little chunk of your business, and the other guy's going, nah, I want to hold on to that. And you're like, yeah, but let me, I just finished watching The Godfather for the 30th time, I don't know, and you got to make them an offer they can't refuse, right? And so I'm not saying like The Godfather did, by the way. That's not what I'm talking about. But and if you haven't watched The Godfather, forgive me for an old joke. But if you have, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, you start seeing those things narrow, and sometimes in not in obvious ways. Finally, you get the deal closed, and what do you do to get it closed? And so that's that process. All right. So that's kind of a basic introduction. That's kind of a, punching right there and hitting you very fast and very hard with an introduction to negotiation. I'm going to quickly scan through my notes to see if there's anything else that I really feel like I absolutely need to tell you before we cut off for today. And I'm not seeing it. Hold on just a minute, though. No, I don't think I need to say anything else today. What you'll be doing is you'll watch these videos, and then you'll do some assignments, which I refer to as quizzes, but it's usually just an assignment where you're answering questions. And of course, we're doing the discussion board questions. And so thank you for your attention, and we'll be talking soon. If you need anything from me, please do not hesitate to email, text. If you text, tell me who you are. Or call. And if I don't answer, please leave a message. I will call you back. All right.